Hi, it's Dr. Steve again, and thanks for visiting our autoimmune website. In this video, I want to talk to you about a very important aspect of autoimmune disease onset and progression, as well as pretty much every health challenge and health problem that we might face. What I'm talking about is the important role that mental and emotional stress and trauma have on the onset and progression of disease. The Centers for Disease Control, in conjunction with Kaiser Permanente, has determined that at least 85% of chronic health conditions have a mental emotional stress trauma component. The CDC with Kaiser put together what is called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. This is one of the largest studies of its kind ever done. So in this study, they reviewed the health records of 14,000 individuals and identified patterns of mental emotional stress and trauma, particularly in childhood, and then correlated the number of those stressful events with health patterns later in life. And they found that there's a very close correlation between the number of such events and the onset of health challenges later in life. Those health problems include depression, addiction, cardiovascular disease, liver disease, COPD, and autoimmunity. In fact, the strongest correlation between the adverse childhood experiences and disease was with autoimmunity. They found that 100% of autoimmune patients had two or more of these events earlier in their life. And these events that create this kind of health effect include abuse, physical, sexual, verbal abuse. Neglect was even a stronger factor. And this would include parents divorcing when one is young, mental illness in the family, the use of addictive substances in the family. So these were some of the key adverse childhood experiences. But it's not only the more dramatic examples that have this effect on health. Even the so-called normal experiences of living, such as the death of a pet, or the death of a spouse or a parent, or loss of a job, or leaving one residence for another in another state or country. So there are a myriad of events in our lives that go into making us human that can have this effect of creating ill health. So let's talk about why this happens. Why do these events end up in degrading our health? Well, it's really because of the way the brain responds to traumatic events and how those traumatic events then affect the function of the brain. So let's look at this diagram. The cerebellum part of our brain, it's back here behind the ears, physiologically tells us if we're in balance. It's involved in accuracy of movement, balance, posture, and coordination, and certain eye movements. By the same token, the cerebellum can be impacted by a mental emotional stress that makes us question if we're safe, that causes us worry, or makes us feel unbalanced in our life. So these can impact the cerebellum, which then communicates its message or signal to all the other brain lobes. Now let's say that someone has said something, and that is now being processed by Wernicke's area in the left temporal lobe. And Wernicke's area is asking if this verbal communication makes sense, if it's logical. If it doesn't make sense, then the content of that communication is sent up or down to the limbic system, which is a primitive brain. And the limbic system is pre-programmed to either confront or avoid based on how this new input compares to prior experiences of pain and suffering and trauma. So let's say that the limbic system puts a frowny face on the communication. That creates an automatic bodily response, which means that glands are fired, hormones are released, tissues are activated according to the interpretation of the limbic system based on its prior programming. So you can appreciate how this can become a vicious cycle, whereby the more this pathway is fired, the more entrained it becomes, and the more perpetual the inclination will be to interpret questionable sensory input into prior experiences of stress and trauma. So that's how the brain gets locked into a cycle that leads to changes in bodily function that ultimately degrade our health. Now, one simple example of how this might work is at a physiological level. If you experience stress or trauma, that can strip what's called a methyl group, carbon and some hydrogen atoms, away from a vitamin, a hormone, or a neurotransmitter, a brain chemical. So that's called methylation, and stress and trauma can have a negative effect on methylation and therefore have a direct impact on how your body functions. So what can we do about this? It seems like almost a hopeless cycle, but there is an answer. So in the initial autoimmune evaluation, one aspect of function that we look at is how the brain lobes are working, are functioning. And if they show signs of having been impacted and therefore have stored the memory of prior stress and trauma. And if these are present, we have tools in our office that allow us to lift those patterns of prior stress and trauma from the brain so those brain lobes can work better and in a more healthy fashion. And we call this component of what we do functional neurology, and it's the way that we have to reset the brain, literally to allow the brain to be new. So more information about the method we use of functional neurology can be found at the website for quantum neuro reset therapy. It's www.qnrt.com. So once you're on the website, click on Client Education, and then look through the information about the ACE study. Also look at core drivers and negative patterns. And that'll give you some good understanding about the importance of this aspect of health in the onset and progression of autoimmune disease. So thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you in the office and helping you.